Welcome to the Evolution Partners podcast, where I talk with the world's leading thinkers, planners, and doers who are helping to build great companies in their own way. We learn how the work they're doing is creating an impact and get to know a little bit more about them and what makes them tick. This episode is brought to you by Evolution Partners, where we help leaders to confidently build enduring great companies using our proven, structured, strategic planning process that ensures you build and execute the right plan. Check us out at evolutionpartners.com.au. Also, you can check out our books, Made to Thrive, outlining how to be a great CEO, as well as Onboarded, which is about making your new hires more effective faster. Stuart Wesley is a director of Oasis People and Culture and has a rich background in pastoral, ministry and family business, specialising in coaching and organisational development, bringing human intelligence to business. Stuart, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be here, Brad. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, after I got to meet you and hear you talk about the work that you do, that must have been a year or two ago, I couldn't resist but trying to have a deep conversation with you. So let's start. As a child, your father had visions of you taking over the family business, as I guess many parents might. But like many, you decided to go your own way. Perhaps you could start by telling us about that, where that decision led you and the work ultimately that you do today.
Yeah, and I will say that my dad, he was never demanding about that at all. I remember it was sort of like just a conversation. Do you want to take this on? And I kind of almost immediately knew, no, that's not what I wanted to do. And part of it was I wanted to live my life, not his again. And so, it was pretty easy. And he celebrated and supported, the direction I took. It's interesting, Brad, my parents always said to me, they were in aluminium windows and glass and the building industry. And they always said to me, if you ever go into business, just go into something to do with people so you don't have to have stock and all the profit is sitting out there in the warehouse or the factory. And I kind of inadvertently followed their advice perfectly and ended up in business. And I think what led me there was actually straight after high school. I was invited, I went to the local high school, Scarborough High School, no longer exists. And I was immediately invited to go back and just start running a program called Campus Life with students. And that was just a really fun experience. I was 5 minutes older than the students, but it was a really fun experience. And that kind of tuned me into, wouldn't it be great to have a professional life just working with people? And we were raised in a really strong, healthy and strong church community. And it wasn't cultish or anything like that. It was really strong and healthy. And back then, it sort of seemed the natural direction that if you want to work with people, then that's a good place to do it. And so that kind of led me into that pastoral ministry direction. And I thought I'd be doing youth ministry and chaplaincy and that sort of stuff, but I kind of fairly quickly rose into more senior positions and, sort of denominational leadership and starting new church communities and things like that. So that was a great experience. But by my late 30s, I was really aware that I needed to engage with the commercial world. I'd grown up in a family business and then I'd sort of transitioned into this sort of church community, and it just felt like there's this world out there that I have not engaged with. In fact, I'm a little bit embarrassed about this, and it's not strictly true, but to this day, I have never had a formal interview. Now, as it turns out, when you're selling things, particularly professional services, you're having interviews all the time. But in terms of an interview for a job, I've never been through that. So
Awesome.
That's kind of that was the journey. And, that was a really important thing for me to rename what I knew, the leadership things that I needed, the communication, obviously, even the counselling and coaching type stuff that I did in pastoral ministry, all sort of has a direct relationship with the work I'm doing now. It just needed to be renamed and reframed to be relevant in a commercial setting. And that's the journey I've been on doing that.
So you're in the ministry, you're feeling like you want to make a change. Tell us about how you got from there to the work that you do today.
Yeah, in the early 2000s, someone said to me, he is a pretty senior executive now in corporate life, and he just said to me one day, Stuart, there's this emerging profession called coaching. I think you'd be really good at it. And it really sparked my attention because I thought I can have really meaningful relationships and conversations with people. And it doesn't have to be around faith, it can be in all sorts of different areas. And that really excited me at the time. And so I ended up doing some training. I got the opportunity to do like an 18-month diploma in professional coaching. And a couple of years later, I did a graduate diploma, which was also 18 months. And that kind of all that coaching experience, it was quite a simple step to morph that into an approach to cultural transformation and organisational development type work. And that was the journey. And so from my late 30s, over the next 10 years, I was really just reshaping what I did whilst I was still doing ministry. I mean, the one thing I also got involved teaching high school students around sexual crime and protective behaviours. And that's I won't worry going into the story of how that emerged, but that was great because that was drawing on my communication ability, and that was a really rich experience as well. So you can see I was just slowly moving into this different space.
So you mentioned coaching. Coaching is a word in Australia, certainly, that has many connotations, and like it's kind of quite confusing for many people looking inward perhaps, and even, to be honest, people inside the coaching community. So how do you define coaching, and what's the type of coaching that you do?
That there is a really good question. And honestly, in Oasis, I don't want to sound arrogant at this point at all, but we get a bit embarrassed sometimes about the term coaching because there's people that have we think we've done really extensive learning in that space. And I know a couple of people have done like a weekend workshop and call themselves coaches afterwards. I think that sort of undermines the credibility of the industry a bit. People have lots of different definitions. For me, coaching is really about helping another person learn and grow. And so it's not so much about teaching them, although there's a teaching aspect to it. But it's really about tuning into what they want and helping them, really in our model, helping them become a more powerful observer of themselves. And once you start to notice what's going on for you, you can actually start to make changes in your life. So that's how I'd describe it.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, it's something that we struggle with. We've struggled with for years. I can remember in 2012 being in America, and we're trying to figure out, should we call ourselves coaches or advisors? And I'm literally driving the car this morning and thinking to myself, should we change our company to advisors rather than leadership team coaches? Just because, like you said, there are people, but I don't know. I guess in a brutal world, the market seems to sort things out as messy it is. And folks like, I guess you and I, with respect, just keep on doing the good work.
I think that's why we talk about things like human intelligence for business or human interactions, a core business process. We use that sort of language, and coaching is a tool that we use. It's not what we do, it's a tool that we use to get the outcomes that we want for people.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask you a quote from Steve Jobs that you spoke about and talked about before that really resonated with me. And I'm going to quote it here. Hopefully I don't misrepresent it. There's a big difference between a human being and being human. Only a few really understand it. What does that mean to you?
Did I quote that to you?
Yes.
Because I couldn't remember.
I wrote it down when you said it. Let's pretend that that was there. Maybe it was just one of those off the cuff remarks that you said at the time, because it was an informal situation. But at the time, it meant something to you, and I wrote it down word for word, and then researched it, and then it meant something to me. So let me hold the mirror up. So there's a big difference between being a human being and being human. Only a few really understand it. So what does that mean to you?
Well, I thought I should Google that when the question was posed and try and sound intelligent, but I didn't do that. I just sat with it, and as I was preparing for the conversation today. And I guess, what came to me as I considered it again was the concept that, you know, a human being sounds like a noun and a being human sounds like a verb. And so the human being names what we are, but the being human names what we do and how we sort of walk through the world and live our lives. So I think I prefer the concept of human being versus human doing. And that's why I was wondering if it was that one I'd quoted, because that's probably more my go-to.
Tell me your go-to.
Sorry?
Well, then tell me about your go-to.
Yeah, so that go-to human being versus human doing, it speaks to me about the notion that a person is more than what they do and that they have an innate value because they're human, regardless of what they do. So what we do is important, but I think we can then find all our identity in our doing. And then if we're not doing well enough, that causes problems for us. Whereas this sense of I am valued because I am human, that's sort of fundamentally important to me. And I guess it comes from a sort of an anthropology that says that human beings are, made in the image of God and that sort of thing. So not everyone will agree with that. That's fine. That's just where I come from. I think that's why that means more to me. Yeah.
It's certainly something that I've observed when people define themselves by their career or their work, and ultimately when that definition is taken away, and it could be in the very, very latter stages of life when they can't work, or it could be any event previous to that, it's a real problem. So being able to define yourself as more than just work is quite important.
Well, I think even, just on that point, when I was leaving pastoral ministry, it feels not right to call that an industry, but let's just call it that for now for the sake of our conversation. But when I was leaving that role, if you'd asked me, do I find my identity in it? My answer would have been a straight 100% no. I do not find my identity in this. But when I did leave that role, and my new consulting work was still unfolding, and what it's like when you're starting businesses, you've usually got some time on your hands, and I actually realized, wow, this actually was part of my identity. I've got some work to do here to sort of recalibrate my thinking. So it's an easy trap to fall into. Maybe it's part of being human that's what we do. We find our identity in our work.
And I think that we're going to get to that in a little while when we talk about the work that you do around the 5 capitals. And so I want to just put a teaser out there to say that identity connects, or we can find deeper meaning through that in these 5 capitals. But I want to now ask you about family offices. Family offices are certainly growing in Australia, but I mean, we're both in Perth, and in Perth, growing quite a lot as the wealth of Western Australia increases. The number of family offices increases. I saw an article about that only in the last week. So you work with a lot of family offices and wealthy families. So what are the big challenges that you find that they experience? I'm really interested if you reflect on all of that, if there are any patterns or any kind of things that you notice across the average.
Yeah, and to clarify, I would say that I'm now connected to quite a range of wealthy families, and there's a few of those families I've done some work for, and there's one that I've done a lot of work for over a lot of years now and deeply embedded in that family, large family office. I also work a lot with farming families. My cousin was the founder of a software business called AgWorld, which he sold 3 or 4 years ago, and he started saying, Stuart, the work you do is really needed in ag and with farming families. So, and with the way, they are wealthy families now, even though they don't always realise it. So what do I notice with wealthy families? Human dynamics and having the skills to navigate relationships is like probably the number one issue. And when I think about my own family, I have 3 sisters and they all have partners and children. When I think about them, we all get on well, but we're also not navigating wealth together. There's no family business that we're navigating, so it's kind of easier. But when I imagine us making decisions together, important decisions around money and wealth and different assets, I just go, oh my goodness, that would be really difficult. So having those skills, and people think, Brad, so many times you hear families speak and they'll talk about the sort of the relational dysfunction like there's a problem, like it's unusual. This is normal. It's just that you've also got a business or wealth in the middle of it, and that just amplifies it more and more. I guess that I want to make that a real encouragement to people that family enterprise, well, just families are hard enough. Add an enterprise into it, it's really difficult. And that's sort of in my history with our own family. I wish there was people in sort of the industry that I'm in and that you're in that were around back in the 70s and 80s that they could have accessed. So that's one thing. I think it's sort of related, is making decisions together is a difficulty, because, take a farming family. You've got mum and dad sitting around the kitchen table making decisions, and then suddenly their kids start growing up and they want in on it as well. And so different generations will have different ways of doing things and seeing things, different values. And then, different family branches will have different makeups of their family and different ages of their kids and different needs and desires. And all of that makes decision making hard. I also think in really wealthy families where there's enough money that people don't necessarily need to work, I think that creates a real issue around purpose. And I think some of the sort of dysfunction that becomes seen in the media, kids off on benders or, drug abuse or whatever it is, can be linked back to this idea of purpose. Because for normal everyday people, our need to provide for ourselves and our family gives us a sense of, okay, we want to do something in the world, and hopefully it's purposeful and provides meaning to us. Not always the case, but hopefully it does. When you take that out of the equation, I think this issue of purpose is a massive one, yeah.
At an individual level, and maybe even, and I'm kind of drawing on what I've heard from you before, at a family level, like the connectedness of purpose throughout the family and the way that kind of transpires into action.
Yeah, and that kind of leads straight into the capitals as well. But before I go there, I think succession seems just really difficult. And I think it often goes back to what we talked about earlier about identity. If I'm the founder and leader of a successful business, who am I if I'm not doing that?
Yeah.
Even if I'm 75, or 80, and really need to sort of hang up the boots and let the next generation take over, this issue of identity is really important. And I kind of, you'll listen to, say, people in their 40s or 50s saying, I wish mum and dad had just let us do it. My heart goes out to the parents as well, saying, how about we work with them to help them get a sense of what their life is about in these latter years. And I don't think our culture does that well. I don't think we honour the wisdom of older years very well at all.
I absolutely agree. I've got a friend, quite a wealthy family, and he's got this concept that they worked on in their family called big dog, small dog. And to your point, the mother or the father, who I guess was running the business or more prominent in the family, let's just say, were quite clearly, when the child was younger, the big dog. And eventually, as the child grows and wants to take on more space and like push into the bigger dog space a little bit, it happens. And then it's almost like it can take decades for this moment to occur. But he said that there is almost like 1 second on one day where the transition happens.
Well, yeah, it's a great insight.
Yeah. And he said from that point, it's like they knew their roles. Now, they were very emotionally intelligent family. They were very attuned, but it still happens. And it's just this almost changing of the guard that happened instantly. I don't know. I mean, it's the hardest thing to navigate, I think, in the family business dynamic. And I don't know if you've got any other experience shares on that or thoughts.
I don't want my sons to beat me at tennis. And, and they still can't. But, I think that, what do I think about that? I'm thinking of, I've seen this a lot in farming, actually, in the ag sector. I think it's really, really sort of rife in that, where you'll see a 40 or 50-year-old living on a promise. One day this will all be yours. So they work for practically nothing. They get to that age of 40 or 50, dad and mum are still hanging on. They've got no assets. All they've got's a promise. And I think that is so disrespectful to the development of the next generation, I think. And yet you've got the older generation just hanging on as well. And everyone's doing it to take care of their own needs. No one's being nasty or, venomous about it.
Yeah.
The motives are fine, but we're all taking care of what matters to us. So opening up, I just think, Brad, you got to open up those conversations.
Yeah, you got to do the work, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it kind of short-term pain equals long-term gain is what I think about.
And I think this will sound a little bit self-serving, but if that's been going on for a while, they're probably not going to have the capacity to have that conversation without people like us actually helping them navigate through the conversation. I know that sounds like a complete sales pitch, but I actually really have just seen it too many times. Yeah.
So it's been said that family wealth, by the third generation, 80% of the money is gone. Like, what's your take on that, first of all? Do we need to simply accept this, or what do you think can be done about it?
Yeah, I've heard those stats and various versions of them as well. Look, I am ever an optimist. You know that saying, a leopard doesn't change its spots. That's true, but I don't believe it for human beings, or I wouldn't be in this work. I think people can transform and change. To that point is, I think the people have to do the development work themselves. It doesn't just happen. So you have to be highly intentional about the next generation. I've heard it said, might have even been Jay Hughes, the sort of the grandfather in this industry. I think it may have been him that said, basically, the quality of marriages and the quality of parenting is actually so crucial to maintaining wealth over generations. And I think the point, it may not have been Jay, I think it is, but the point being, there's nothing like a divorce to torch some wealth, and there's nothing like, if you haven't raised children who have the character to be able to manage wealth, because it's psychological, right? So if they haven't been raised to do that, then you're in trouble. And this book here, I know that most of the people are listening, but Raising Financially Fit Kids by Jolene Godfrey. That is such a practical book that actually gives stages of development and the character traits that need to be happening within children at different stages. And this book here, the 10 by 10 Learning Roadmap by Stephen Goldberg, that book, Advancing Flourishing in Families of Wealth, again gives a really clear framework around, at this age, in this age span, here's what's going on developmentally, and here's what's needed to help them flourish. So these sort of tools can be really good. In fact, that 10 by 10, I was reading it, and at the same time, I was really frustrated with my youngest son. I have 4 kids, 2 boys, 2 girls. My youngest son, he's 23. I was really frustrated with him, and I was reading this, and there's this stage from age 19 to about age 25, and sort of, I think it's called emerging adulthood, and it's all about experimenting, going in different directions, trial and error, all this sort of stuff. And I read this and I thought, Stuart, you are so putting a 59-year-old lens over your 23-year-old son. Give him a break and allow him to grow. And then I think of my older kids, and I can see that they have gone through that journey and are in a different phase. So I think some of those tools can just give us some rigorous frameworks rather than just what we were raised with or what we think out of our own wisdom.
It's a real challenge. Certainly the first point that you raised there, and I love the point, and we'll put all of the books in the show notes, all of the topics, so listeners will have the opportunity to seek them out if they so desire. A growing wealth, scaling a business takes all your energy. Like, it is incredibly draining or time consuming effort that can continue to demand and demand and demand. But unless you take care of, let me say, the home fires, the family, the relationship with the spouse, the kids as appropriate, the legacy that you're actually endeavoring to build on the outset is all for naught, or even worse, over subsequent generations, it'll erode or evaporate. So yeah, you raise a really, really good point there, that we've got to, as business operators, assuming that we're running a business to build our wealth, we've got to be able to keep the home fires burning and build children of good character and have a strong relationship.
Yeah, I'm very committed to that.
And that's who you are, right? Which is...
Nobody lies, you've heard it said, nobody lies on their deathbed saying, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. That is never the regret. It's always about family.
So, it's a great segue to the 5 capitals we've alluded to at least a couple of times. So it's the work from Jay Hughes that you've mentioned. You've kind of really dug really deep into this. So I'm really interested if you can explain the overarching concept of the 5 capitals, A, and then B. Let's jump into them perhaps one by one.
Yeah, what I've seen Jay do is he sort of holds his hand up with the thumb on the bottom. You kind of put it on the table, your hand on the table, the thumb is the foundation, and he talks about the thumb kind of being the financial capital. But the question of what's the financial capital for? And this is, I've done a couple of keynotes in ag contexts and saying, so what's your farm for? What's the wealth for? And it's just a question that people haven't often considered, because it just seems like, well, I've got lots of wealth. Isn't that what it's for? And what Jay says is, well, no, the money is there for a purpose, and it's there to allow human beings to flourish. That money can be deployed to allow both family and community to flourish. And so then he defines it and he says, well, there's financial capital, but there's also human capital. There's intellectual capital, there's social capital, and spiritual capital. And I just love this concept that it starts to provide a vision for how wealth can be used intergenerationally, beyond just looking after the money for what it. Money does nothing if it doesn't enhance your life. It's just sitting in the bank, does it? It's got to be deployed.
And I think I'm just about to jump into those, but I think that unless you are in the situation of a family who's building and curating wealth, and for listeners, and your perception of that situation is drawn from the media, there's a very good chance that it's not accurate, right? And so let's jump into human. I think you've covered financial, right? So financial provides the foundation for the other one. Do we need to define financial, do you think, or we've covered that?
No, I think, your balance sheet, risk management, all of that.
Yep, financial security and freedom. So human, what is human capital?
So it's really about promoting individual flourishing and ensuring that the basic requirements for food and shelter and clothing are met. It's the importance of work to a person's self-work, developing a strong sense of identity separate from the family's financial success. So you hear that in psychology, they call it individuation, this idea of being able to stand on your own 2 feet. Human capital is enhanced by encouraging travel and working and living in other places. So it's this individual, and it's the individual well-being and collective well-being of the families. I often see the human one as sort of it's almost overarching as well. Financial is the base, and then human seems to sort of is a catch-all for everything as well.
What happens if you don't get human capital? I'll say right, but I don't mean right. I mean, what happens if you don't work on, develop, evolve, have a strong human capital?
Well, I think people just their view of the world gets distorted, and they start, they'll live for money, for example, or they'll, I often think of the Hebrew word shalom, which we say peace. Shalom, it's Jewish word for peace. It actually means well-being in all of life, sort of well-being and flourishing in all of life. And I think if you don't get that human capital, if you don't develop that, you won't be experiencing shalom. And so there will be just areas of your life where it's just like, this is not good. It's not enriching. It's not bringing joy. It's not serving me in any way. In fact, it's doing the opposite. So it's that, I think, this idea of well-being in all of life is what it's about. And if you don't invest in it, so I've had times in my life, you can imagine as a minister, we didn't get paid that much. I've had times in my life where the financial wasn't getting taken care of, and so the human capital part, things like shelter and food. I mean, we always had a roof over our heads, but it really got undermined. The human capital got undermined through that time.
Lovely, thank you. So let's move on to intellectual. Intellectual capital? What is it? How does it play out?
Yeah, this one's sort of more straightforward because it's really about what we know as individuals and as a family unit. So, but it's about our formal and our informal education. So it's what we know and what we're learning and what we're sharing together. And it includes things like learning from other cultures. So it's not just sort of book learning or academic learning, but it includes that. So the intellectual capital is how we're growing what our family knows together, and how do we support individuals to learn and grow. And even in families that are not, when our family is not a family of great wealth, although globally we are, of course, but in a Western context, pretty average. But even in our family, like, we have made intellectual capital such a priority around education. And our kids know that. We support our grandchildren's education. And that is sort of a key plank of what we're about. So it's leaning into that.
And you raise a really important point, right? If I'm a listener and I don't have a family office and I'm, maybe I'm doing okay, does this model, 5 capitals, still apply to me, or is it relevant and can I work on these things?
Absolutely. And I guess that's my point, is that, as an ordinary sort of Australian family, we use these capitals. We can see them playing out in our lives. And in fact, this decision to start supporting financially our grandchildren's education actually came out of learning these 5 capitals. And we were able to say, you know what, that intellectual capital, education is such a value to us. Let's lean into that for our kids. And even our kids, we said, when you finish school, you are going to be trained in something. And one of them got a trade. Three others went to university, but we don't consider the trade any less at all. It's just that was his pathway.
And so what happens when you get intellectual capital? I'm going to say wrong, and I don't mean wrong. When you don't invest in that as a family, what are the kind of the consequences that you might think of?
You just get caught in an echo chamber.
Yeah.
Of your own knowledge. It's still self-referencing. I'm thinking of a personal example of, when we have advisors, we have financial advisors, my wife and I, even in our situation. But if we want advice, financial advice, and I'm thinking of a situation last year, there's 2 couples we're going to go to and ask their opinion, and they are both wealthy, successful people, because I know that if I go to some of my friends that are the same as me, I'll just get the echo chamber. So this is about, so intellectual capital is about, lose the arrogance that and go and be a learner, have a beginner's mind and go out and explore. That felt a bit passionate about that, to be honest.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. And let's ask about social.
So this is, again, it's fairly straightforward. It's about reciprocal and meaningful relationships. So it's the capacity of the family to have the relational capacity to make joint decisions together. It's about leadership. It's also about the reputation of the family in the community that it's in. So it's also about citizenship and volunteer work. That just, how are we going with each other and with those around us?
Yeah. And that's an interesting one. One might think, doesn't that just happen anyway if you're a wealthy family, or if, like you've got the freedom perhaps to be more social, someone might think. Like maybe just scratch the surface on that a little bit more.
Well, I think you go into things like how do we build trust together, and trust is such a foundational, it's such a foundation of everything that we do in relationships. So how do we build that? And if it's not there, it's really game over. It's like the engine has seized if you haven't got trust. So if you've not got strong social capital, the human dynamics will fracture.
Yeah.
How can you do anything without the sort of relationships that allow you to trust each other, to make decisions together, etc.?
Yep. Love it. And I think that is the answer in how does it not work is within that, in that we don't have trust. The relationships fracture. Spiritual capital.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and people often think of this as, oh well, I'm not spiritual, but it's not related to a spiritual or to a religious tradition or faith tradition in particular, although it could be. I think it would probably be pretty clear that for me and for our family, the Christian worldview and faith does actually provide that is the center point of our spiritual capital. But this is really about a meaning and a purpose beyond yourself. So what is it that your family's about? What do you stand for as an individual, as a family, that is kind of beyond you? And I think that's a great question to ask, because it kind of lifts up our eyes from ourselves to the transcendent, but also to just others out there. And so exploring that is a really rich thing, particularly if you've got wealth that provides all the needs provides all your needs very well. This idea of, well, what can it be used for? What are we about? What do we stand for? What do we want to see happen in the world? So spiritual capital might be expressed with a real commitment to the environment and to working in that community. It might be expressed, we have a desire to see people housed. And so a key part of our purpose in the world is to see that happen. So it sort of goes into the philanthropic sort of areas as well. Jay Hughes says that, this is a direct quote, he said, a family that's nothing but financial capital is toast. A family that is nothing but financial capital is toast. In other words, what we're talking about here is this is about being human, actually, to go back to Steve Jobs. This is what we're actually talking about. It's just financial capital. It's just not enough.
It creates problems. It really does. And the problems that it creates, what I love about, I guess, your passion on the subject and the capitals, is that it is transferable to all. It's not just about the wealthy or the family office, but it just, when I look at the problems that I've seen eventuate, you can stem them back to this. And equally, I'm thinking about Maslow's hierarchy and finding self-actualization and a lot of those things, not only for the founder, but for the other family members and the generations, like the grandchildren, let's say, or whatever it is. Like that is really important. And so it's important to know that they're not going to be, miserable kids without a purpose or so forth. So focusing on these areas. So financial, human, intellectual, social, spiritual capitals. James E. Hughes is the author of that book. We'll put that in the show notes as well. So anything else on the 5 capitals, maybe to wrap it up on that section before we move on?
No, simply to say that I think that is just quite a simple and elegant framework to think about life. And even for any family, whether they're a family of wealth or not, to think about, what do we want? What are we building here? What are we investing in terms of our family life? And I would say that it's rarer, but there are some families, and I, in the pursuit of purpose and meaning in the first half of my sort of career, if you like, I freely say we did not pay attention to financial capital to anywhere near the extent that we needed to. And that was a massive miss. That was a massive miss on our part. And so we're sort of, the second half has been catching up on that and getting that in place. But likewise, missing on the other ones is really important. So it's a bit of a diagnostic tool as well.
Love it. Yeah, if the financial isn't right, and by right I mean if you haven't got enough money such that it causes you immense amounts of stress, everything else you can't build on that.
Correct, yeah.
And
it goes back to Maslow's, you're not
Yeah.
going to get to that word.
Actualization.
Yeah. You're not going to get there if you don't know where your next meal's coming from.
So if I change gears, I'm working on a book and it's about bigger isn't better, better is better. It's about the work that we do to build a better business rather than a bigger business. Not that businesses shouldn't grow, but saying that super large goals for no purpose can actually undermine what we really want in life. So for you, how would you describe a better business?
I think what comes to mind for me is one of the models that we feel really passionate about in Oasis, which is that, and people and culture, clearly we're about people and culture, but the notion of like leadership that pays attention to getting work done, building trust-based relationships and developing people. And they're not three distinct categories. They overlap with each other in a Venn diagram type of way. That I'm a leader we've got to get work done, but I get that done through building trust-based relationships with people and developing people and not just developing them to be better in my business, but developing them as human beings, as professionals who will contribute to my business, and they might take it somewhere else they probably will take it somewhere else at some point. And that's the nature of life. So I guess that's what I'd offer, Brad, is
Love it.
That leadership model really drives us.
My interpretation, the way that we would communicate something similar to leaders, owner or manager or leader, is a business is just people doing stuff. And our job as leaders, managers, is to grow the people to become better versions of themselves on a multifaceted level to do this stuff.
Yeah. And I would add, and to grow the people and their relationships with each other.
Beautiful.
It's the team that makes it all happen.
Beautiful. What is a book that you would recommend for our audience?
Well, there's two actually. These are crackers. They're by the Arbinger Institute. The first one that really impacted me was called The Anatomy of Peace. And it's a book that is written in narrative form. And it's the story of a dad who's got a problem son. And he has to go, the son is going into a sort of an outward bound type experience. But the father and the mother have to be there at day one of it. And it tells his story around that Anatomy of Peace. And then the second book is called Leadership and Self-Deception. And again, it follows that guy's story into how he applied all those principles that we read about in the Anatomy of Peace into his business. Two very easy to read books, but very, very powerful as well. So the Anatomy of Peace, Leadership and Self-Deception.
Lovely. We will put that in the show notes as well. How can people learn more about you and your business?
Our website, oasispc.com.au, is probably the best way to do it, or I'm sure they can get my contact details from you, and we'd love to hear from anyone who's interested.
Again, in the show notes. What haven't we discussed that you wanted to cover off today?
I think we're done. You've left me at a blank right now. I have nothing to add.
Very good, very good. Well, Stuart, I'm deeply grateful of you sharing your time with me and our audience. I love interesting conversations and the work that you're doing around helping people to find meaning and longevity in terms of these 5 capitals. And helping is just, I think it's really important at a human level. And so, I thank you again for your time joining me on this podcast today.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Brad.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the episode as much as I did. If you'd be kind enough to leave a review for the podcast, that'd be really helpful to other like-minded entrepreneurs, and then we can grow our community. If you want to find out more about our guests, head over to evolutionpartners.com.au/podcast, where you can find show notes and other additional reading. Hope to see you back next week. Until then, keep thriving.